here, and we're queer, and I've forgotten what I was going to say. Hello, my name is Dan, and today I would like to once again talk to you about the Magnus Archives. So, keen-eyed viewers most likely noticed some little signs in the background of my last video that indicate that I am not straight, nor am I cis. Such hints as, of course, this postcard of Leo by Austin artist Drew Riley from her Gender Portrait series. Anyway, I only bring this up because I wanted to assure you guys that for this video, I'm speaking from an enlightened place, because I'm queer and I'm trans, so whatever I say today, I want you to dogmatically recite to your friends, and, you know, if they ask for credentials, be like, oh, I heard it from a real-life trans person. Haha, that's a funny joke, but that's not how any of this works, obviously. Gays are not interchangeable. Like, don't get me wrong, I love and cherish all our commonalities, but aside from some basic things that most of us can probably agree on, we all come from different backgrounds, have different goals, and even different tastes. Weird, right? There are some pieces of gay representation that I'm not a fan of, but which have given thousands of other people immeasurable comfort, you know? Plus, obviously, most things exist on a spectrum, so it's not even like you can sort things into a binary good or bad for representation. You can't just punch in the code for gay representation into a formula on your computer and end up with a non-controversial, deeply impactful piece of media. Storytelling just doesn't work like that. So I decided to skew this one a little bit more personal, since the last one was so hyper-professional, and sort of outline to you guys what my personal rubric is, what aspects of LGBT representation I find worthwhile, and what choices I find less worthwhile. I don't really think that my thoughts are universal, but I also don't think that they're that controversial. But if you find yourself emphatically agreeing or disagreeing, please let me know in the comments below. I'm constantly angered that I have but a singular perspective. I'm limited to this little body, but through the powers of communication, I can learn about other perspectives. But for now, I'll stop stalling and tell you mine. I'll be discussing these things in a sort of numbered list, which I like to visualize as one of those dog hurdle things. Clearing each hurdle is in and of itself a good thing, but also not as impressive as clearing the one above it. It'll make sense as we keep moving, I promise. Side note, if you haven't already seen my first video on the podcast, I'd recommend maybe checking it out, especially if you're new to the series. In that last video, I outlined Season 1 through the start of Season 5. In this one, I will not be giving nearly as much context. I'll basically be working under the assumption that you've either listened to the series or you've otherwise been caught up on what's going on. Hurdle number 1. Queer? Who's queer? For this one, the bar is basically on the ground. The only thing that this hurdle has over exclusively cishet media is that it introduces the vague idea of queerness. It's gay in the same way that LaCroix is flavored, which is to say, theoretically. How does this hurdle handle gay stuff? Mostly in the form of jokes, innuendos, stereotypes, and other subtle wink nudges to the audience. This kind of media likes to present LGBT identity as a fun what if, akin to asking, what if your whole body was lip skin? Presumed to be equally unlikely, so the provocative suggestion can only be met with absurdist mocking humor, or some level of disgust and bewilderment. There's plenty of nomenclature to discuss the various ways this manifests in media, most commonly known being queerbaiting. But hey, listen, even low-hanging hurdles have their worth, so for each hurdle, I'll be discussing what makes them rad and what makes them bad. It rhymes. Are you proud of me? Rad. Covert gays. Unfortunately, LGBT folks have faced discrimination for ages. We're talking your mere existence is a crime. There are places today where that's still the case. As such, queer people have mastered the art of blending in. Passing as cis and het is something you learn really quickly when you find out how deviation from that norm is punished. So you end up with a lot of gay people who are trapped in the closet for protection, who are mistaken for straight people and given the same advantages that straight people are given. These people sometimes succeed in sneaking little acts of rebellion into the media that they make. Little bits of queer, hidden in obscure references and meaningful eye contact. Casual innuendos or jokes, tiny inscrutable transgressions. I think that that's badass. Equally badass is the knowledge that your similarly covert gay audience will probably still pick these things up, and feeling solidarity from a distance, and celebrating the fact that cis-hets aren't accustomed to reading into things as in-depth, so it mostly flies over their heads. It's a fun way to be like, you're gonna make us live in the shadows? Fine, I'll get real good at shadow puppetry. Badass. So, when LGBT people see themselves in these types of characters, it does make sense. It's natural to want to reclaim that little bit of representation that you have in media. Bad. When non-LGBT people use this type of representation, that nuance can be tossed right out the window. This can be a fun way for them to have their fruitcake and make fun of it too. Oftentimes they want the clout that comes with checking boxes, but they can't be bothered to write a compelling gay character. They use gay jokes or innuendo or reference stereotypical gay things in an uncommittal way to appear dubiously gay. Gay enough to be fun, but not enough to get into trouble with anybody who is homophobic in their demographic. This sends a lot of gross messages. Like, hetero is the default. Maybe people can be gay, but it's a choice and a weakness that ought to be kept secret. It also serves to punish a queer audience for daring to relate or identify with on-screen characters, pulling the chair out from under them, for daring to imagine themselves within a narrative. Anyway, moving on. Hurdle 2. Love the sinner, hate the sin. Okay, maybe kill the sinner too. I feel like the title's pretty self-explanatory, so let's just jump in. Rad. Once again, covert gays have used this one a lot to sneak in their own representation, as it was often the only way to have gay shit even depicted. Think like Gothic literature. You could show a gay kiss, or somebody gender non-conforming, but the catch was that you had to immediately punish them for it, narratively, so as to set a good example. This likely fed into the need to have really ostentatious gay villains. They might have to die, but nothing is stopping them from living life to the absolute max before their predestined fate comes. Bad. Hate the sinner, not the sin mindset still reinforces the idea that straight and cis is the default and anything else is a choice that only the most deprived or misguided would make. Queerness in these stories is often portrayed as somehow contagious. Take Carmilla from her titular novella, and honestly, all subsequent vampire fiction. Deviant sexuality has always been paired with homoeroticism, and specifically lesbianism. Carmilla was turned at a certain point from her natural existence. She was turned from a naive countess into a predatory lesbian vampire, presumably by her own predatory lesbian vampire. There was an event that marked the change from her natural state into a new monstrous one, and crucially, even though she never intended to be a monster, she is still dead set on perpetrating gay horror. Hurdle 3. Maybe the real monster was the repression we learned along the way. We're really high up on the hurdles by now. I'm proud of us. This is where it gets tricky, more nuanced. We're at the level of gay characters getting their own arcs, their own stories. This is impressive, but now we have to wonder, how did this homosexual figure out that they were destined for a queer life in a heteronormative world? How did they learn that they were different? How did this news affect them? Did they struggle? Was it bad? Was it like real bad? Why do you think it was so hard? These are the questions that this hurdle likes to focus on. Rad. This can be brutally honest about the pain that comes from living in a world that is prejudiced against you, the struggle of deciding whether to live safely but miserably in the closet, or take the risk of coming out to face an intolerant world. It's a hard choice, it's a process, but most importantly, it's deeply personal. It's a choice that's made more complicated due to varying levels of acceptance across age, geography, culture, gender, etc. There's no right or wrong way to come out, there's no time limit, and you're not a bad person simply for not telling people your sexuality or gender identity. And these kinds of stories can help you explore just different iterations of coming out. In my opinion, Jennifer's Body is a really great exploration of these ideas. It's a black comedy about women, sexuality, identity, and power. It's honestly, to me, the quintessential repression narrative. It explores the relationship between Needy, and Jennifer, two deeply closeted bisexual women who have very different relationships with their bodies and their sexualities. Sorry, I have a lot of thoughts and feelings about this movie. For now, what I'm trying to get at here is there's a lot of really interesting, narratively compelling ways to explore the horror of oppression when it comes to queer identities. Bad. If I'm gay and repressed is peak gay storytelling, it reduces the LGBT experience to one of suffering and anguish, which is a super despair-inducing implication and, frankly, a super irresponsible one. Straight and cis audiences don't tend to have great insight into the ways that repression can impact one's life in this regard, and so even depictions of that struggle, which are meant to be cathartic, can fail to accurately represent anything real and fall flat, come across as demeaning. Or, alternatively, these stories can imply that coming out is like the culmination of your gay journey, one that happens once and then fixes everything. There's just a lot of ways to get this wrong. Gay repression is just one of those wells that all the least creative cis-hetero hands like to dip into. It helps them make gay tear soup, which is a fine delicacy for some, akin to the bird spit soup. The battling with themselves, tempted by the fruit, closet homosexual is sometimes a favorite of baby gays, but also, unfortunately, of heteros. They especially love storytelling where there's a brave one, the one that's already out of the closet, but let's be real, he's a bit too gay to hide, isn't he? He keeps pressuring his significant other to come out and be brave and stop being selfish or being ashamed of me and just come out already. But I digress. In the horror genre, repression works a bit differently. Conventionally, that which is repressed in horror will always come back to haunt you. For what I consider to be a particularly weak example of this, let's look at It Chapter 2. Just the movie, but for brevity's sake. Although the narrative is full of examples why it's totally rational to want to stay safe in the closet, like the fucking opening scene for instance, the closeted gay character Richie is still narratively punished for his inability to talk honestly about his queer attraction. Unlike the rest of the Losers Club, Richie is unable to surrender his real token for the ritual to banish the crab clown demon god. It's framed as his weakness, some weird hang-up he has, and not a survival instinct in response to years surrounded by homophobes threatening his safety and existence. Yes, contextually, it makes sense that he's punished, and yes, although Eddie is the one who dies, Richie is the one who's being narratively punished here. Eddie has already conquered his fear in an earlier scene. Richie's punishment might make sense, as we know what is required from him, but the storytellers still decided that of all the characters, it should be this singular gay man in the main group who's punished. While I don't think it's responsible to always shy away from the horrors produced by homophobia and transphobia, or indeed any form of bigotry, I still think it's important to remember that these kind of narrative decisions carry weight, and you should be careful not to accidentally victim blame. I also tend to worry when modern works have homophobic characters who are secretly gay. Not that this doesn't tend to happen in real life, but because when stories focus on this gay-on-gay crime, as it were, it can overlook real malicious agents, such as those espousing and manifesting homophobic and transphobic rhetoric. Hurdle 4. I'm just like you, but gay. These are sometimes what my friends and I call gay media for straight people, as it does feel as if it was made for the express purpose of making straight people comfortable with the existence of gay people.
I'm just like you. I'm just like you.
Brad. This hurdle has the ambitious goal of making gays relatable, fun, and marketable, but most importantly, normal. I can't deny that this has played an important part in the cultural shift. The change from gay monsters to gay best friends to gay protagonist is a really impressive leap when you think about it. And again, I want to take the time to praise and thank all the queer creators who have helped fucking pave this yellow brick road. This stuff tends to be on the sappier side, and while it's not really my cup of tea all the time, I can't deny that it's had a visible impact on LGBT youth's outlook, and I'm happy for them. Being able to see sitcoms and rom-coms and reality shows with gay people just being people, it's so nice to see kids who aren't riddled with guilt and uncertainty because they feel like they have permission to exist in media. Bad. As is the case when any smaller cultural element is adapted into the mainstream, it can set the precedent of LGBT people having to package themselves in a way that comforts and consoles cis-hetero expectations. It can force the beautiful spectrum of queer existence into painfully forced, arbitrary binary frameworks. These are the rigid thought boundaries that compel straight people to ask who wears the pants in the relationship. This is the straightest question, as it exposes the mildewy underbelly of heteronormativity. This question isn't really about your pants, obviously, they don't care about your wardrobe. This is a question about power. Which of you holds power in the relationship, and which of you does not? This is quite sad to me, as this means that heterosexual people consider it normal for their relationships to be so superbly unbalanced. It makes me sad that they project this understanding onto queer relationships, and end up with a severely limited understanding of not only queer love, but love in general. In the neighboring genre of transmedia for cis people, there's similarly a lot lost in translation. The nuances of gender expression, experimentation, presentation can be reduced to a magical girl makeover for cis-hetero audiences. Support role. I don't have a funny name for this one, but stereotypes. If the following bits have been the hurdles, this is more like the stands on either side that hold the whole thing together. Now, I want to say, I'm not actually totally against using stereotypes in your writing. The same way I'm not opposed to using genre tropes. Their usage defines their efficacy. Effective writers can work with the assumptions that people make, and can mess around with them. Rad. Using archetypal characters isn't inherently bad or lazy. Much of storytelling relies on using narrative shorthand to convey certain things. And in real life, I feel like we all put on stereotypes when we're in new environments, so people can more quickly get what our whole deal is. And then, as we feel more comfortable, we reveal the more authentic self over time. You don't meet a person and instantly know everything about them. Everyone's got an outer face and an inner face. Writing stereotypes well, to me, means being aware that your characters themselves are likely also aware of these existing stereotypes, and deciding what the relationship to that stereotype can be a fun way to characterize them. Is this a persona that they put on for the comfort of others? Are they dogmatic, naive, or otherwise not fully fulfilled characters who use stereotypes to fill in blanks in their personality? These are the kinds of fun ideas that you can explore through the usage of stereotypes. Bad. Then there's straight up uncurious, lazy stereotypes. For wool, we got the U-Haul lesbians, the, toxically masculine lesbians that hate men, predatory lesbians, wool who are only sexual with women for the benefit of the presumed straight male viewer. For Momo, we got effeminate divas who are interested in fashion and gossip and sex. Trans people are obsessed with passing and gender-specific activities. And then there's stuff like, the ubiquitously queer-coded villain, and so on and so on. Also bad. In addition to the bad implications of many of these stereotypes, it also sends a gross message about the fact that you're always going to be able to spot a queer person. This is also an idea for cis-hetero comfort. This idea that they will always be able to know on sight who's queer. Not everyone is as obvious as I am. We're not interchangeable, like I said earlier. Do I look like the sort of queer who knows a goddamn thing about fashion? Or, I don't know, what's a masculine gay thing? Sports? Do I look like I know what a first down is? Of course not. I know about podcasts and sculpting hands and the Game Boy Hamtaro games. I do have a lot to say about those, and yes, maybe I just undermine my own point by being a pretty stereotypical, weird, artsy queer, but you know what I mean here. Using fashion or softball or whatever for shorthand for this person is queer is super reductive if that's as deep as the character gets. Questions to consider moving forward. How are LGBT characters introduced? How do they interact with the story? How are they framed by the narrative? What are their motivations, their aspirations? What do they want? What do they need? Are they dynamic characters that grow and change? Do they have their own arcs? Or are they an accessory to someone else's? How is their queer identity brought up? Why? How does this information impact the story? Does their identity prompt or relate to the horror? How? Do they fall into any stereotypes? What aspects of this character does the narrative give the most screen time? How are they characterized by others within the narrative? If they suffer, how? Why? How is it framed? And this is a, I don't know, maybe a personal thing. I don't know if anyone else has thought of this, but have you considered adding more than one gay character? Because it doesn't happen in real life, this thing where it's all straight people and then there's one gay person. It doesn't happen a lot in my experience. Gays travel in herds for safety. Plus, the more gay characters you have, the less weighty your narrative decisions will be when you write them. What do I mean by that? Well, this is a convenient segue to finally start talking about the Magnus Archives. How gay is it, though? Most of the cast is. This is one of the first things to get praise whenever people are talking about the series. Just off the top of the dome, for Team Woolwool, we got Melanie King, Georgie Barker, Jude Perry, Alice Daisy Tonner, and Basara Hussein. Those last two are common fanon, but I'll get into those later. For the Mulmul, we got Tim Stoker, Martin Blackwood, Jonathan Sims, Graham Folger, and Antonio Blake. Oliver Banks. For people who are bisexual or pansexual or polysexual or otherwise just confirmed to be attracted to multiple genders, we've got Tim, John, and Georgie. For confirmed trans people, we have Alexia Crawley from episode 110, Creature Feature. For ace people, we have the main character, John. And are there more? Probably. Listen, like I mentioned briefly earlier, this show nails the fact that gays travel in herds for safety and security, and by setting the precedent that queerness is a mundane, everyday thing, the podcast feels more receptive to fan theories than most. But I'll talk about popular fanon later on. How is their queerness revealed? Well, I think a great place to start in this analysis would be with Graham Folger, the neighbor of a statement giver in episode 3, Across the Street. He's a pretty minor character, only ever mentioned in 2, maybe 3 episodes, but he's the first gay reveal, and I think we can learn a lot about how the show wants to handle these kind of things going forward. So, the first question, how do we figure out he's gay? Well, the story is told from the perspective of a woman who is all up in his business. She notices him behaving a bit odd in a college class and decides to keep an eye on him. He just switches between hypervigilance and checking right the fuck out, and he's obsessed with writing in these little journals, but while she's fixated on him, she gets Joe spookied and ends up with a concussion.
Shouldn't be left alone for the next few hours. But the upshot was I agreed to go back to Graham's flat to recover. He was quite awkward about the whole thing and took great pains to assure me that there was nothing untoward about the situation. Apparently he was gay, which I'll admit did actually reassure me a bit.
Now, there's a few ways you could read this passage, and I fully feel that, but I don't know, I personally liked it. The story is following the same basic story beats and themes and pacing of the other stories so far, and matches its level of uncanny. It's not obvious from the snippets I've shown, but Graham is currently going through a lot of supernatural stress, most immediately those caused by his sexy table. But victims of these kinds of trickery act really shady and weird, so it does make sense for the narrator to be put off by him. And my favorite detail, he tells her that he's gay to reassure her that she's safe with him. Like, I felt reassured. That's a fun bit of characterization. Graham is this awkward, paranoid older dude, one beset by supernatural hijinks, but he still goes out of his way to ensure the safety of a classmate, a person he barely knows. And even if he would have personally preferred not to spend his night this way, he still volunteered a bit of personal information to make her feel more comfortable while they pass the time. It's subtle, and the way it's phrased is fun, like, oh, don't worry, I'm not straight. Like, the joke is that straight men are the worst, and he doesn't want her thinking of him like that. It doesn't feel forced. In fact, it's the opposite. This is the sort of detail that they could have omitted or rewritten, but they wanted to give us the bit of information that Graham dates men. I personally think it's because they wanted us to make the connection that he is the Graham mentioned by Antonio Blake, aka Oliver Banks. While we never get a statement from Graham directly on this possibility, because he gets replaced by a stranger and dies off screen before the end of episode 3. Don't worry about it, I'll get to it. Alexia Crawley. Similarly, in episode 110, Creature Feature, when statement giver Alexia Crawley is telling her story, she brings up the fact that she was outed as trans in order to explain why her career as a DOP was stunted. This story is a web story, as is evident from the presence of Spider, and interesting enough, it is read by Martin. Anyway, the web is fear of being controlled, of being somebody's puppet, and that perfectly describes Alexia's feelings towards her eccentric director, Dexter Banks. Due to the discrimination she encountered after being outed, Alexia wasn't left with any professional bridges intact, and so she had to rely on a director who needed her expertise to make him look good. Of course, later on, there's the giant evil spider that eats a bunch of actors, but the core of the story is, for me, about this woman who is caught in a much more mundane web. Alexia being trans, in my opinion, is treated very well. The reveal adds context to her story that was absolutely needed to be able to understand the full story, and blessedly it does not reduce Alexia to sadness porn. Her tale is pretty much on par with the same bewildered general terror that one can expect from a statement in TMA. If anything, the statement is mostly that of a professional woman in media, aggravated to hell because the egocentric people above her won't let her do her job. She's great at what she does, and resents the very societal strings that keep her from fully realizing her potential as a creative. These same strings have put her into some really creepy situations, the culmination of which is, of course, seeing a huge ass spider who has apparently eaten all the actors of the movie you are working on. She gives her statement to the archive, who, as per usual, does nothing to help her in any way. So Alexia also told her entire story to the press, and evidently that didn't go very well. To my knowledge, this is the only account from somebody being explicitly trans in the podcast so far, and I think it's a step in the right direction. And listen, I know what you're probably thinking, but trust me, I'll get around to it. For now, just let me appreciate the casual, matter-of-fact way that queerness is first overtly introduced into this narrative. I don't mean to harp on it so much, but it's just such an easy thing to do, even for a minor character, and it just very quickly establishes, okay, this is the kind of story where there are gay people, without slowing down the plot or feeling tangential, and going forward, this precedent is followed pretty reliably. But that's just a side character. How do they handle the main queer cast? Well, let's see. In no particular order, how do they handle Timothy Stoker?
Basira has refused to compromise her position any further, so we're having to rely on Tim's involvement with certain staff at the police records office. Apparently he is involved both with one of the young ladies there, as well as the gentleman who manages the other shift. This is useful for acquiring information, but I am uncomfortable with how easily discovered this arrangement might be. The last thing I want is for the archives to become involved in pointless personal drama.
These casual references made by John Archivist let us know a few things. 1. Tim is involved with multiple partners of multiple genders. 2. Tim is comfortable with his coworkers knowing this. 3. He's comfortable using his charm to gain access to information. And 4. John Archivist is uncomfortable, not with sexual deviancy or even with Tim leveraging his charisma for gain, but with how easily discoverable this arrangement is. This is good characterization for both John and Tim. Tim is a people person, somebody who oozes charm and who lights up whatever statement his voice appears in. He's less restricted, more easygoing in season 1, telling jokes, lighting the mood, and is very outwardly different from the typically dour, introverted narrator John.
He did suggest I try to get you involved.
And I suggest that he not be a scary magic psychopath.
Whoops.
Too late.
No stigma, no pause for the cishet audience, no what, man and woman, pick a side. And the fact that he's a flirt who gathers information helps further the plot. And it's not his only trait. It barely warrants that much discussion at all, which makes sense, given the prime narrator. Speaking of whomst, yeah, John, asexual Sims, is really not that interested in Tim's sex life. And no, that's not me making inferences. That's a fact about his character. It's a fact that was in the mind of Jonathan Sims from a pretty early point in the creation process. His asexuality is established in canon as simply and as nonchalantly as any other identity. A bit of gossip between coworkers, overheard by one of those ever-present tape recorders, tells us some stuff. Let's look.
Do you know if he and John ever... No clue, and not interested. Although, according to Georgie, John doesn't. At all.
Huh. Yeah, that does explain some stuff.
Well, the initial question asked by Basira implies that there's a degree of fascination or affection shared between these two that is more than platonic, and that she wouldn't be surprised if the two had a romantic or sexual history. The response she receives from Melanie, who at this point in time is likely beginning her courtship of Georgie, volunteers information that she received from John's ex-girlfriend. This shows us that she's aware and comfortable with both her girlfriends and John's bisexuality, which, while this might sound wild if you're utterly cis and het, like, I know to you guys we're all just like rainbow freaks, but there's sometimes weird internalized bigotries between gay people and bi people. And so that not even being touched on is a possibility just makes me happy. So this conversation helps to normalize Martin's attraction to John. I mean, yes, they find it cringy, but not for homophobic reasons. John's asexuality and the existence of bisexual people. There is some implication happening with that explains a lot, but it doesn't feel malicious or judgmental. It more so feels like an acquaintance retroactively understanding the hidden context of their friends' statements.
Some office gossip, which I'm not sure is necessary or conducive to a workplace that it's natural, it's normal. There's no sinister hidden motives, or it's fine. It's fine.
Speaking of boys in relationships, Martin Blackwood, my personal favorite character. He's a nice middle ground between John and Tim's social aptitude. Martin is far more affable than John, but way more awkward than Tim. His initial explicit gay reveal happens in the same conversation I just referenced, which I like, as it retroactively paints a specific image of the previous interactions between the two. Their dynamic begins outwardly antagonistic. In the first season, John is a snobbish boss, constantly frustrated with Martin's superstitions, who seems to roll his eyes at every friendly gesture that Martin makes. Martin, for his part, is a well-meaning worrywart who is determined to make things better for John and for everyone in the archives. What we see of their relationship in season 1 isn't overly flirty or romantic, so cishet audiences were probably able to miss the subtle gay undertones. Don't get me wrong, there's definitely plenty of people in the audience who picked up the scent of enemies to friends to lovers in the air, but it was absolutely something that straight audiences might have missed the setup for. Hence the necessity of this scene to tell everybody, this couple is planned, you're not crazy, these two do have a bit of a thing for each other. Oliver is revealed like so, in a similar way to Jude Perry. These two fall into a category that I will go into later. Melanie just dates Georgie. She keeps it a secret, because by the time she's dating Georgie, she has every reason to distrust John's presence, as well as the presence of the tapes. It would make perfect sense for her to withhold this. John only finds out by accident when he compels Melanie unintentionally. When he finally puts two and two together, he doesn't blame her for not telling him, nor does he act at all surprised that a woman he used to date is currently dating another woman. It's not a shameful secret because two gays, it's kept under secret because 1, spooky horror shit, 2, Melanie doesn't particularly like or trust John, and 3, it's pretty awkward to date your boss's ex even if they're cool. I really like the dynamic between Melanie, Georgie, and John. Like, I enjoy amicable exes in storytelling. I like the fact that these people were right for each other in a more platonic way. Like, that's good, that's great. And then Daisy and Basira, well, they have a unique bond worthy of their own video later on, maybe. We'll find out. But what of their souls? Okay, well, maybe there's a whole mess of them, but gayer things have been revealed to be homophobic in the end. Now, a question I want to ask really quickly is, what's the difference between burying your gays and gay people just dying? Well, to me, burying is akin to sweeping something under the rug, but the rug is 6 feet of dirt. It's employed when creators have reached the limit of their capacities in writing queer characters, so it's a very violent, narratively punishing way to remove them and have no further loose ends to tie up. But a good way to figure out if your characters have been buried or if they've just died is figuring out how death works in that universe. In a 1-2 punch handling suffering and death, let's look at more simple morality like in Nightmare on Elm Street and the 80s slasher era morality. In these, death and suffering were punishment for immoral behaviors, like taking drugs, drinking, doing sexuals, or, other things that people were not liking in the 80s. The final girl is a product of this. She is often the most purest, most goodest, most virginal girl who survives because of goodness overcoming evil, which is violent and bad. Compare that to the Magnus Archives, where who lives? Whether by lack of virtue or ambition or sheer dumb luck, whoever lives is whoever possesses the most power. This is an unfair system, one that runs on a currency that very few people really understand. So living and thriving is the furthest thing from a moral judgment. This is not a meritocracy. It's a cold and cruel world where the good frequently do die young, and those who are willing to do harm to others are the most likely to succeed. Like many works of supernatural horror, there's a big question about what it means to fear death, to bargain with it, and to accept your own mortality. The Magnus Archives is full of characters who are able to circumvent their own deaths, most commonly by becoming avatars. And while the characters themselves aren't always judged this choice, I feel like it's pretty safe to say that refusing death is always a choice that bears some sinister implications. Think about this story, wherein a man gambled with the Grim Reaper to escape death, only to become a Grim Reaper himself, devoid of identity and agency, forced to repeat the same monotonous, joyless task forever. The Magnus Archives' stance on death itself is pretty evident. It's natural. It can come about in some horrific ways, but the cessation itself is what gives life meaning. Our fear of it is what can be toxic, our original sin, if you will. That desperation has driven some well-intentioned people into depths that they can't return from. In short, those who run from death must pay a terrible cost. It's also sometimes framed as the only way to be neutral in a sense, especially after season 5. I won't say good or moral, as I'm not really sure that that's a thing that exists in this story anymore, maybe, or at all. But as the conversation with John and Martin in this episode explores, it seems like the world is reduced to a cruel binary, one where you can either be the tormentor or the tormented. So what does it mean to suffer in this story? Who does it affect, and how? Well, here's the thing, this is a story about suffering, about terror, about fear. This is the kind of story where you absolutely want to torment your darlings, as this is how you're going to get to know them. Narratively speaking, those most likely to die are those who have been explored enough. This is best exemplified with Tim. His death was the logical end point of his character.
This place is evil, Martin. And I think doing what it wants probably makes us evil. I mean, I'm not going to stop you, but at the same time...
I get it.
He's verbally acknowledged that he does not want to be a victim of this world, but nor does he want to perpetuate the evil to save himself. And this is a cold, grim nightmare hypercapitalism, so there's only really one thing that could happen to him. In that light, although I personally am not a huge fan of the going out in a blaze of glory type of ending, I don't hate Tim's end. I'm sad for it, obviously, I love Tim, but Tim's last wishes were granted by his own action. He wanted to put a stop to the unknowing, revenge his brother, and he wanted to escape the fears. He got those things, in a way. Death, for Tim, was a choice he made, perhaps the last real decision he got any input on. But what's important to me is that his death suits the narrative it exists within. It's following the same logic, the same level of difficulty, the same risks and threats that we've been hearing about this whole time. It's not some out-of-nowhere, last-minute tearjerker. Even the season finale, which, at time of writing, has not come out quite yet, there's been meaningful discussion of how the ending will arrive.
We're gonna have to kill John? It seems like something we should at least consider. Any other price? I'll pay it. What are you going to do when he tries to sacrifice himself?
John and Martin have been discussing the fact that one or both of them may die as the only logical ending to the tragedy we've been listening to, the culmination of these series of choices. I gotta be honest, I'm alternating between deeply, deeply sad and delusionally optimistic that there might be some way that my guys survive. The fact that I'm so deeply invested in their pain, though, should tell you something in and of itself. I know what I was getting into. I didn't come here to be comforted or coddled. I came here to see if this story could break my heart in half. And it certainly has, in a variety of ways. And that means that it made me care, made me empathize, and it featured characters that I could see myself in. Which brings me to my next point. Gay people have fears too. Horror is cathartic because we have issues that we've been compressing into the back of our minds. We do this to create society, but those bundles of terrors and all those bad feelings linger. So we try to jostle them out. We go into an environment where it makes sense that we'd be feeling scared or whatever. We feel things in extremis. The framing and narrative structure is literally built to give you the worst time. Like, when you go on a roller coaster, you expect your guts to move around. You expect to hear about upsetting things, about impulsive thoughts that have tormented people. You expect to share those feelings with others and have a bonding experience over how, at least, reality is less shitty than that nightmare you all experienced together in fiction. It's a very gentle form of a trauma bond, in a sense. There's tremendous worth in the horror genre as a vent for the subconscious mind. There is absolutely nothing wrong with preferring stories with more optimism when it comes to LGBT content, but I personally really crave the catharsis of identifying with a character who gets put through the absolute ringer in some spooky way. I want my LGBT faves to deal with hard shit, not to punish them or comment on their life choices or whatever, but because good horror demands that. I want media that takes me and my fears seriously, and one way or another, I've found that in the Magnus Archives. But to be honest, it's for way more than the reasons I've listed above, and has a lot more to do with John and Martin and John Martin. But the more I read about that, the more I realized that John Martin needed to be its own video, one where I'll be looking at both the canon and fanon that exists of these two characters. If you've enjoyed my content here today, I hope you'll check out some of my other videos and maybe follow me on social media and yell at me, recommend something spooky or something gay, or ideally something both. And maybe I'll talk about it next. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good night.